Please be seated. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this academic ceremony. First of all, welcome to Ricardo de Sousa, who will, in the meanwhile, defend his thesis. I would like to welcome you, first of all, and then, of course, your wife, and your parents, most welcome here, and your cousin, Arminda. And finally, Mr. Elvin, from the Embassy of Portugal. We welcome you here in particular, and I hope that you enjoy this ceremony. It all depends, of course, on Ricardo de Sousa's defense. We'll invite him first to give us a short presentation of your work, your reasons for having undertaken it, and of course your conclusions. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So, good afternoon all. Mr. Recca Magnificus, highly learned supervisors, highly learned opponents, family, friends, and colleagues. Many thanks for being in my public defense. As a result of the work I performed with the United Nations in East Timor and Guyana, I developed a need to better understand the macrodynamics at play with external interventions in the context of conflict. When further looking into it, I identified that most civil wars have several external interventions, and that this happen in mounts with an average conflict intensity higher than the conflict intensity of mounts without external interventions. Like with health, it is puzzling why so much medicine in a form of interventions has not been able to cure the illness of civil wars. In the end, external interventions may be the cause or the result of the higher intensity in the civil wars. This puzzle informed my main dissertation research question. What is the effect of external interventions on civil war intensity? Adopting a theoretically driven and empiricist approach, I structured the answer to this question on 4 research stages corresponding to 4 papers. Studies on the effect of external interventions on conflict have focused on its effects on conflict duration and not so much on its effects on conflict intensity. Among them, a distinction can be made between the targets and the types of interventions. The targets of interventions refer to the direction of support given. Partisan interventions are intended to build the capacity of the parties and can be in support of the government or the opposition. Neutral interventions have a conflict mitigation objective and can be in support of any of the sides of the conflict. Studies identify that neutral interventions increase the duration of conflict, while partisan interventions can increase the chances of victory by the supported side, and if in support of the rebels, can lead to bloodier wars. The types of interventions, on the other hand, refer to them being military, economic, or diplomatic. Even if most partisan interventions are military or economic, and most neutral interventions are diplomatic, it is expected that each of these types of interventions will have a specific effect on conflict, regardless of its target. Results show that both military and economic interventions increase conflict duration, while diplomatic interventions facilitate the termination of civil wars. Overall, the results suggest that partisan, neutral, military, and economic interventions prolong civil wars, while diplomatic interventions can shorten them. But these results are still controversial. Among other studies, it has been suggested that if a military intervention is partisan in support of the opposition, it can shorten civil wars. Therefore, it is not clear the escalatory or the de-escalatory effects of the different targets and types of interventions. In order to clarify the puzzle of the research and these findings, a theoretical framework using a rational choice approach to decision-making processes of parties in a conflict is adopted. The starting point is that parties in a conflict make a cost-benefit analysis of the utility of fighting compared to the expected net benefits of the outcome of the conflict versus a settlement through negotiations. External interventions will affect the balance of capabilities of the parties, and in this way, the cost-benefit analysis of the parties. Partisan interventions increase the fighting capacity, and neutral interventions create incentives for a political solution. But these effects are not permanent on the calculations of the parties in a conflict, as conceptualized by other researchers. The parties will respond to the increased capacity or incentives for peace But after a period of time, a new equilibrium is found where the intervention effects do not play a direct role in the decision-making of the parties. Logically and by inference, the partisan neutral interventions' expected effects is extended to the types of interventions. In summary, the model proposes that partisan, military, and economic interventions increase conflict intensity, while neutral and diplomatic interventions decrease conflict intensity. In order to test this model, I used a mixed method approach. In the first stage of the research, I investigated different conceptualizations of conflict, the dependent variable of the model, through a comparison of a set of data sets. The conclusion was that research is about compromises over the conceptualization and operationalization of the object of analysis in a way that corresponds to requirements of scientific validity and reliability. As a result, an operationalization of conflict as armed conflict was adopted, with a selection of the Uppsala Conflict Data Program definition of civil war. For the civil war cases in Africa that occurred between the end of the Cold War and 2010, a new data set of external interventions, the main independent variable, was developed and is presented in the second paper. The new data set builds on the work of Patrick Reagan with a series of novelties. In my work, external interventions are defined as convention-breaking political, economic, or military actions in a country, which includes UN and non-UN interventions, targeting the authority structures of the country in order to influence the balance of power between the parties. The new data set contains data on 42 conflicts, which occur in 30 countries in Africa, corresponding to 5,582 conflict mounts and 576 external interventions. Using this data set, 2 tests of the theoretical model are done. One with a country case study on the 3rd paper, and another through econometric testing on the 4th paper. A case of Central and South Somalia is selected because it covered the full period of analysis and had a variation on both the intensity of conflict and types and targets of external interventions. A chronological historic analysis is used to test the model. The particularities of the Somali case, often referred to as an extreme case of state collapse, characterized by clan and warlord structures of authority, needed an enlargement of the scope of conflict, not only to consider the civil wars, but also communal violence and one-sided violence. A preliminary finding is that the effects of interventions on conflict intensity depends on the nature of the conflict and objectives of the intervention. As expected, neutral military interventions of the humanitarian type have the capacity to de-escalate conflict, while partisan military interventions lead to conflict escalation if both sides are being supported. Diplomatic interventions which are neutral can decrease conflict intensity, but surprisingly, they have no effect if they are partisan. Domestic partisan interventions occur in cases where external actors sponsor competing mediation initiatives. Furthermore, and contrary to the model expectations, 3 situations were identified where diplomatic interventions can increase conflict intensity. These refer to the choice of which parties to include and not include in the mediation processes, and to the dynamics that can occur when negotiations fail. These unexpected results of diplomacy escalating conflict inform the proposition to be tested with econometric analysis. A proposition is added to the main model, suggesting that it is the failed mediation which increases conflict intensity. The rationale is that when parties engage in mediation, it is solely a strategy to build up fighting capacity, or that, as identified in the case study, when mediation fails, there is only a military alternative for solving the conflict. In the econometric analysis, on the first stage, I have used a conflict intensity level model, where conflict intensity levels are regressed on the targets and types of interventions, controlling for a series of relevant aspects, including previous levels of conflict intensity. The results confirm the main theoretical propositions, which are also in line with most findings of the literature. But on a second stage, I have used an improved method to control for the reverse causality in the relationship between interventions and conflict intensity. In this, a conflict intervention change model is used, where the change of conflict intensity in each month is regressed on the changes of the values of the main independent and control variables. The results confirm the escalatory effect of partisan military and economic interventions, but neutral and diplomatic interventions effects are found non-significant. This unexpected result of the lack of the de-escalatory effect of neutral diplomacy could be explained by the new proposition that it is a failed diplomacy that is removing the significance of diplomacy and neutral interventions. In order to test this proposition, a new model was developed. Using a similar estimation technique, on the first stage, a conflict intensity level model was used to determine the relevance of successful and failed mediation to conflict intensity. The results suggest that failed mediation has no effect on conflict intensity, but that successful mediation de-escalates conflict, and this effect is stronger the more successful mediation is. But on the second stage, when using the conflict intensity change model, similar to the one presented before, all the results become non-significant. Therefore, it is not safe to conclude on an explanation for the lack of effect of diplomacy and neutral interventions on conflict intensity. The main answer to the research question is that partisan, military, and economic interventions increase conflict intensity, and that neutral and diplomatic interventions seem not to have a significant effect on conflict intensity. Building on the significance of the results of military interventions, an additional analysis is performed. Military interventions are governed by specific international laws. In particular, the United Nations Charter gives the United Nations Security Council the primacy in deciding about military interventions in another country, except in cases of self-defense. The fifth paper and last paper of the dissertation investigates how is the United Nations Security Council primacy upheld at the African Union level and in its subsidiarity principle. Through process tracing, the paper identifies that conceptually there are exceptions to United Nations Security Council primacy at policy documents of both the United Nations and the African Union. The idea that a military intervention could occur while awaiting for United Nations Security Council approval is present in the 2004 UN report and in the 2005 African Union El-Zouini consensus. Regarding the principle of subsidiarity, the analysis identifies that its conceptualization and application to the security sector is very embryonic, but that when deciding on a distribution of power, the criteria is mainly concerned with the capacity for a fast military response to a crisis and less with the intervention's legality. In conclusion, diplomacy and neutral interventions do not have the expected effect of de-escalating conflicts, and this cannot be attributed to the failed mediation cases. This is an important result that requires further scrutiny. But a word of caution is necessary on the application of these results. Studies identify that even in the cases when mediation fails, for instance, when a peace agreement breaks down, when the conflict resumes, it has lower levels of conflict intensity than before the peace agreement was signed. The other result, military and economic and partisan interventions in general have an escalatory effect on conflict intensity. This follows directly from the theoretical model and justifies that, in particular, military action should be governed by appropriate international law. For this reason, the final paper alerts to the fact that there are exceptions to United Nations Security Council primacy, and that the way the subsidiarity is implemented may or may not reinforce United Nations Security Council primacy as a foundational principle of the security interventions doctrine. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.